morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd like to welcome you to the Canada FASD Research Network's webinar, FASD from a Rights-Based Perspective, Unpacking the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. My name's Audrey McFarlane, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canada FASD Research Network, and I've been in this role for about 10 years. Prior to this, I was the Executive Director for the Lakeland Center for FASD for almost 20 years. So I've been involved in this field for a very long time, and it's an honor to host this webinar today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion on these rights. Before we start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the important step in reconciliation in the acknowledgement of traditional treaty lands and recognition of the peoples in these territories. The Canada FASD Research Network recognizes the historical significance and contributions of Indigenous peoples and their cultures and understands the important role that Indigenous communities play today and in the future. We acknowledge that we live, work, and meet on traditional territories across Canada of many of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. So today's topic is a really good one, and it is really good also to be in a place where FASD is seen as a real disability. And although we still have a lot to do, we are able to have this discussion on the rights of people with FASD. As you will hear today, the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of People with Disabilities is a very big deal in the world of disabilities. Canada has agreed to the convention or the statements about the rights of people with disabilities and has had to report every few years to the United Nations about their progress. Canada will undergo a review this coming year, and CanFASD was involved in the development of the Civil Society Report, which is a report submitted to the UN on behalf of all the organizations that support and represent people with disabilities in Canada. The Government of Canada also submits their own report to the UN. I just am so happy that this is the first time that FASD is specifically represented in these reports. And so we want to share with you some of the work that the UN and begin discussions on the rights within our own community. Today, we're going to focus on two specific conventions, the right to the right diagnosis and the right to housing. So, to help us all with this discussion, we have three excellent presenters that have been thinking about this work for quite a while. And they are Dr. Kelly Harding, Dorothy Reed, and Lauren Richardson. Dr. Kelly Harding received her PhD in Interdisciplinary Rural and Northern Health from Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. Kelly is the Director of Research Administration and Research Associate with the CanFASD Research Network. She is also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Psychology at Laurentian University. Kelly has a background in human development, interdisciplinary health, and health service delivery, particularly in rural and northern communities. She has worked in the field of FASD since 2010 and is involved in diverse research projects in the area of FASD prevention and women's health, FASD assessment and diagnosis, family well-being, mental health, and human rights. Welcome, Kelly. Dorothy Reed is the owner of Reed Wellness Consulting, providing consultation and training to individuals and organizations on maintaining wellness. Dorothy worked with the correctional system primarily in the area of mental health service development and delivery, and she has extensive professional experience in working with individuals with FASD and other mental health concerns and developed interventions for offenders with cognitive deficits. After obtaining a diagnosis of FASD for her two sons, Dorothy and her husband were involved in the development of support groups for parents, caregivers, and children with disabilities. And Dorothy is one of our long-standing Family Advisory Committee members. Lauren is an individual who is living with fetal alcohol syndrome. She was diagnosed March 31st, 2014. She is adopted from the country of El Salvador from the city of Santa Ana and has two amazing parents and two amazing siblings. Lauren became an advocate for FASD shortly after getting her diagnosis because she believes that there is so much strength and power behind her condition that most do not know about unless they talk with her, and walk beside her in this journey. Lauren has rearranged her whole life to advocate about FASD to hopefully shine some light on and in both of the very realistic and hopeful ways. Lauren is also a longtime member of the CanFASD Adults with FASD collaboration team. So welcome all of you, and I'll turn it over to, I think, Kelly to start.
Hey, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Audrey. So I'm Kelly Harding. I'm going to start us off today in this presentation. I'm here as the kind of researcher and academic lens, so I'm going to talk a little bit about FASD, give a little bit of context about what the UN CRPD is and what some of the rights in that convention are. And then we're going to have an open discussion at 2 points throughout the presentation with Dorothy and Lauren about two rights in particular, as Audrey spoke to. So around diagnosis and around housing. So first and foremost, I know that Audrey gave a lovely land acknowledgement to start us off, but as presenters, we also wanted to acknowledge the unique and individual lands that we all come from and join you from today. So I'm joining you from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory in Sudbury, Ontario. It's also home to the Wanapitei First Nation, and it is a blistering but beautiful, cold and snowy day where I am. And Dorothy and Lauren, if you want to also say the lands that you're joining from today.
Hi, I'm from Abbotsford, BC, and I'm joining you from the lands of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Stolo people, of which the Sumas and Matsqui tribes are part. And they've been caring for this land since time immemorial, and I'm committed to trying to take as good care of the land as they have. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Richardson, and I am coming to you from the province of BC. I sit on many nations over here on Vancouver Island. One in particular is the Squamish First Nations and the Indigenous people from the town of Sydney as well.
Perfect. Thank you both. And so we are all committed to reconciliation in our personal and professional lives, and certainly thinking from an Indigenous lens of how that also plays into conversations around human rights and in the context of disability as well is a really important consideration and framework in some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but we really wanted to frame this presentation with a little bit about what FASD is and then move into the human rights lens. Because as we know and as we talk about, FASD is unique. And so in these larger contexts and conversations we have about disability, there's sometimes challenges of wanting to ensure that the unique needs of people with FASD are represented and brought forward in the context of rights, but also thinking about times where maybe a pan-disability approach or a more unified approach can be really helpful. And so when we talk about FASD, and especially in the context of rights, really want to think about a balanced perspective to FASD. So there is something to be said for talking about some of the adverse outcomes and some of the challenges, and certainly the way that violations of rights can enhance adversity for people with FASD, but also really wanting to think about strengths and about hopes and ways that we can advocate as people with living experience, as people that come alongside people with living experience about the strengths of people with FASD and how we can bring that into conversations about rights. And so framed within all of that is also thinking about what all of the complexities are as they intersect with FASD. And so I'm not going to go into depth about all of these today, but thinking about the ways that the social determinants of health influence outcomes for people with FASD. We're going to talk quite a bit about how the UN CRPD is framed within a social model of disability. And so it's maybe not actually the disability itself, that gives challenges to people with FASD. It's the structural barriers and challenges. It's the social inequalities that perpetuate negative outcomes or challenges for people with FASD. We're also thinking about intergenerational impacts of FASD. We're thinking about the uniqueness of stigma and how stigma, blame, and judgment can further compound conversations and rights for people with FASD. Thinking about environmental adversity, other occurring health conditions or mental health conditions, and the unique and caregiver family experiences and living experiences that Dorothy and Lauren are going to speak to later. And so thinking about adverse outcomes, we talk a lot about co-occurring adverse outcomes in terms of mental health conditions, in terms of struggles in the education system, finding educated teachers, involvement with the criminal legal system, trouble with housing, and so on. And so I want to challenge you to think about why these adverse outcomes may actually not be because of FASD or because of the disability itself, but rather because of the violations of rights for people with FASD. And so reminding everyone about that balanced perspective that when we only talk about challenges or we only talk about difficulties, we don't actually see the whole holistic or humanistic view. We don't see the whole picture of what's actually going on here. And so when we transition that to think about human rights, FASD does not necessarily equal adversity. So FASD or adversity is not caused by FASD as a disability. FASD is not the root cause of these adverse outcomes. And thinking about this aligned with the foundation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and other rights-based legislation, it's actually the social and systemic barriers that people with FASD experience that can lead to these adverse outcomes and experiences. And so one way to ensure that we're presenting a balanced representation is using a rights-based approach or a rights-based lens in the way that we think about and talk about FASD. And so this can be an actual mechanism to flip the script, to present the adversity associated with FASD, rather to a conversation about human diversity and a way that people can thrive when they're actually provided with environments, support systems, and opportunities that lead to success. So what are human rights? So the concept of rights. So human rights are globally agreed upon standards. So it's a universal standard for ensuring that everyone in the world, regardless of anything inherent to you, so things like your disability status, your age, your ethnicity, your gender, and so on, that you are provided with the opportunity to live with dignity and freedom from fear of harassment or discrimination. And so human rights are relevant to all of us, not just individuals who face mistreatment. They protect us in many areas of our day-to-day lives, including our right to have an expression of our opinion, our right to education, our right to privacy and family life, and our right not to be mistreated or wrongfully punished by the state. And so, as I said, they're basic rights that belong to every person in the world, also across the lifespan, so from birth to death, and they apply to everyone, regardless of any of your individual social locations. And these apply as a common standard for all peoples and all nations. However, in saying that, we also recognize that not everyone experiences these rights equally, and certainly people are subject to violations of these rights, and certainly in the form of discrimination, where people are not actually able to experience the same standard of living, of education, of healthcare, and so on, because of things like social location, so because of things like disability. And we do know that people with disabilities experience discrimination. So there's a long history of social exclusion, so the historic institutionalization and still institutionalization of people with disabilities, barriers to accessing accommodations. So for example, having things like formal supports that help you stay in your home, that help you with your day-to-day life. We also see tokenism, or on the other hand, a lack of voice for people with living experience to talk about their own disability, to come forward with their own view of perhaps identifying as a disabled person and what that actually is like for them. And certainly on the extreme end of things, we see things like victimization and disability-related hate crimes. So how do we address those things? So one of the ways that globally we've worked to address those things is the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the focus of our presentation today. But I did also want to flag that there are other conventions that also are important in this larger conversation. And so the UN CRPD is the first human rights treaty of the 21st century. It was adopted by the UN on December 6th, 2006, and subsequently has 164 signatories and 182 ratifications by nation states, including Canada. So the UN CRPD and other conventions do not create new human rights, but rather they provide explicit instruction on how countries should work to ensure these rights and to be accountable for how perhaps these rights are not met for the intended groups. And so there are other conventions that are relevant and we've thought about too in terms of rights of the children, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's also in terms of focus on women and girls, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and many, many others that are relevant to this larger conversation as well. But that is beyond the scope of our presentation today. So what is the UN CRPD? What does it do? Why do we want to talk about it? So the UN CRPD is an agreement that says that persons with disabilities should have the same support and treatment as everyone else. And so countries can decide for themselves whether or not to essentially approve the convention, agree to the convention, which is when they sign and ratify. And then it becomes a legal promise. So as Audrey mentioned in the introduction, Canada is being evaluated this year. So the countries that ratify are actually responsible of reporting back to the UN what they have done and how they have addressed each of the rights in the convention. And then what's referred to as civil society has an opportunity to also report from their view of how Canada is doing. So that's individual citizens, that's groups that support people with disabilities, self-advocates, and so on across a very large array representing disability. And so, as I mentioned, the CRPD was adopted in 2006, and Canada ratified on March 11th, 2010. And so by ratifying the agreement, Canada has agreed to follow the articles in the CRPD. The CRPD addresses many provinces. We're going to talk about 2 of them, as I mentioned today, but it does have a total of 50 articles that explain what those promises are. So there's, for example, a preamble and some introductory articles that outline basically the universal standards of the CRPD. So these are like the overarching principles, such as things like anti-discrimination or intersectionality that inform the other articles that follow. And then the additional articles are more focused on particular areas. So for example, awareness raising, healthcare, education, housing, involvement in the community, and so on. And so the CRPD is based on the social model of disability, in which disability is viewed as an interaction between individual impairment and environmental barriers. And the CRPD recognizes the importance of not only ensuring the civil and political rights of individuals with disabilities are met, but also that the social, economic, and cultural rights are met as well. And I always just like to show this image. So in also thinking about accessibility, it was really challenging to put this presentation together in a way that was not very text heavy and very technical about what these rights are. And so the Arch Disability Law Center is a wonderful resource, and they have put together this fantastic visual representation of the UN CRPD. And so it's got all of the different artwork about the different rights and the different sort of lenses. So you see the nothing about us without us at the top right there, thinking about accessibility, equality, and so on. So I encourage you to refer to this image and also to check out their website for more information here as well. So as I mentioned, there are 50 articles. And so aside from the provisions or the introductory pieces around definitions, principles, and so on, there are 26 specific articles that cover a variety of issues across the lifespan. And so what we have been doing at CanFASD, I've been trying to think about how we can advocate using a rights-based lens and how we can have focused conversations about rights and bringing FASD into that work. And so we put together this issue paper a couple of years ago that really came from a concern in the broader FASD community that the needs of people with FASD were not being adequately identified and addressed, and that a way that we could think about doing that was from a human rights-based lens to support. And so in that paper, we outlined 3 areas pertaining to FASD. So in the context of access to diagnostic services, interventions, and public awareness, housing, and overrepresentation in the criminal legal system. And we're going to spend a little bit of time today focusing more intentionally on the first 2 of those. So with that, we're going to move into our discussion of 2 examples. So I'm going to actually present what the rights in the UN CRPD are, and then we're going to have a conversation with Dorothy and Lauren about what this actually means from a living experience perspective, making it a bit more accessible about what this actually means in everyday life. So diagnosis and identity. So there actually is not a specific convention that pertains to the right to diagnosis, but there are several articles that are important in larger conversations about diagnosis and subsequently support for that diagnosis. So the first one is awareness raising. And so this is basically exactly what it says in the title. This is around making sure that everyone is educated about disability and that we take appropriate measures to respond individually to people's uniqueness and their disabilities, so that people in society are aware of disability, they are aware of the rights of people with disability, and in turn we foster respect and dignity for people with disabilities, working to combat stereotypes, prejudices, and harmful practices as they pertain to people with disabilities, and promoting awareness about the capabilities and contributions of persons with disabilities. So once again, coming back to that strength-based approach, thinking about how people with FASD can successfully be included in their communities, can give back, can participate in society. Another big one is around health. And so this is where people with disabilities have the right to the enjoyment of the highest standard of health without discrimination on the basis of their disability, and that individuals with disability have the same access to healthcare, to health insurance, and so on, that everyone else has in society. And so persons with disabilities should have the same range, quality, and standard of free and affordable healthcare. Those health services should take into consideration people's disabilities. And importantly, they identify here early identification and intervention as appropriate. So that's predicated on having successfully identified and received your FASD diagnosis, so that supports and services can be tailored to your individual needs. And another kind of area that we could go off, I think, in a totally different conversation is also ensuring that these services are accessible so that they are in people's communities, including rural, northern, and remote areas in terms of accessing health services. They also require healthcare professionals to provide care of the same quality to persons with disabilities as they would to any of their other patients or clients. And so this is also considering things like free and informed consent, not being coerced into particular health decision-making that's not of their own autonomy or free will, and considering the needs of persons with disabilities in training and ethical standards of care. And then a little bit less relevant in the context specifically where we're talking about diagnosis. So as you can see, a lot of these articles are really long and have many caveats and provisions even within the overall concept, but also in terms of prohibiting discrimination in the context of health insurance or life insurance, and preventing denial of healthcare based on the basis of disability. So I have spoken a lot, and I would love to invite my co-presenters to come join me at this point. And so we're going to go to Lauren first. So Lauren, I mean, that was a lot of information, but maybe just to start with, can you share your experience with your FASD diagnosis?
It's been a long journey. I would say because I was diagnosed a lot later in life, I fell through the cracks in terms of my schooling. I fell through cracks in terms of my family life. I grew up in a family that was they were the perfect family. My grandparents were extremely perfect. My aunt, my niece, or sorry, my aunt and my cousin were very perfect. So me being neurodivergent in a perfect family didn't really mesh well, because I had to hold up a lot of standards that were not really realistic for myself. I came with a lot of other things in terms of having a facial deformity. So I came with a lot of extra surgical things that need to happen. I was also, I think I was also somebody, especially in school, that was seen and not heard. I didn't voice a lot of concerns around my education early on, which I wish I had. I didn't get diagnosed till I was 27, so I went from being neurotypical or growing up neurotypically to then all of a sudden becoming disabled overnight and having to learn about my disability and educate myself on my own disability. And then what I had to have happen next was to educate my family on what my disability entailed and how it played out for me. I don't think they understood it. I think they tried, but I don't think they understood it. So I'm lost a lot of the time. My mother tried really hard with me. She wanted me to be a child of freedom, and so when I got the diagnosis at 27, I had to really educate the whole family on it, because it's not just an individual diagnosis, it's a family diagnosis. So I had to bring my mother to my first conference. I had to bring her to meet other individuals who had fetal alcohol as well. I had to educate. I had to find education by attending conferences, by then finding people who live with fetal alcohol themselves. The very first person I ever met with fetal alcohol was Miles, and he came into my life like a breath of fresh air, and he helped guide me kind of through the process of what diagnosis meant for me. And over the years, I've attended conferences and I've spoke internationally and nationally at different things. And I realized that the diagnosis doesn't own me, I own it. And my strength has to come through education and talking about this. I've got to work alongside Dorothy Reed and you, Dr. Kelly Harding, and I met Audrey, and I've met Audrey in person, which is great. And I've realized that there's a whole group of people out there, that a whole other world of people out there that understand this disability and that want to learn from people like myself, and others who live with this disability 24/7, 365. So, I've come a long way, but I realized that getting the diagnosis for myself, not only for myself, but for my family, I think ultimately set my family free, and it set me free as an individual, because I don't have to be all so lost, and my family is around to kind of support that in many ways. And it's beautiful to see when you go through life as a neurotypical for 27 years and then you go the rest of your life as a neurodivergent, and it's a totally different lens, and you have to completely shift. So that's kind of my story for now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. I think that's really beautiful in what you're saying too about it's a family diagnosis and it impacts, not just you, but all of the people around you. And so I think that's a lovely transition to Dorothy, if you want to talk about your experience with FASD diagnosis and your caregiving role and so on.
Thanks. I think, Lauren, you really summed it up when you said that it is a family diagnosis, and that that it changes your perspective. Although you said that you were neurotypical most of your life and then became neurodivergent, my guess is you were probably neurodivergent all along, but didn't know that and didn't have that ability to put it in perspective. And I think that's one of the things that really happened for me, was that when I got the diagnosis for my kids, it helped to put things in perspective. It's not like the behaviors changed or anything like that, but I could understand things a lot better. And I think when it comes to diagnosis, it's really important to recognize that that is a right for them to be able to, for people with FASD to be able to go to a specialist to get assessed, appropriately assessed, as a right. And when we look, CanFASD worked with Lana Popov to do a paper on the diagnostic capacity in Canada. It was just so striking that some of the results they found is that 98% of cases of FASD were undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And that given the growth in the population and the diagnostic capacity in Canada, that basically the capacity would have to increase, 67-fold per year to meet the demand. So that means that there are many Canadians that are not able to get a diagnosis for their disability. And as a caregiver, I need that diagnosis to be able to advocate for my kids. And I want to give you a specific example. Two boys, raised two boys. My oldest son was misdiagnosed. He was diagnosed given the FASD standards that they had at that time. I shouldn't say he was misdiagnosed, but he was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. He was not diagnosed with FASD because he didn't have the facial features associated with FASD. My youngest son was diagnosed a few years later with different criteria, and he was diagnosed with a form of FASD, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disability. And it made a real difference in their trajectory. My oldest son, we were able to get treatment for the attention deficit that helped him in school, but it wasn't sufficient. It didn't address the complexity and the uniqueness of FASD. It didn't address a lot of the behaviors. It didn't give us the ability to be able to advocate with the school, for example, for specialized intervention. As a result, he dropped out of school in grade 9. Never got any farther than that. Our youngest son, with the diagnosis, it allowed us to meet with the school to talk about the need for specialized care, specialized intervention. For example, he was able to qualify for an educational assistant and had an educational assistant that stayed with him throughout his elementary school. And that made a huge difference because he developed that relationship. We were able to talk to the teachers and met with the teachers early in the year to provide some education about what FASD was and what his needs were. We didn't have PopFast then, so there wasn't a lot of information and education for teachers. Got to put in a plug for PopFast because they do such incredible work. It also allowed us to access disability funding, which made a big difference in terms of being able to afford to get private assessments and psychoeducational assessments that helped the school address his needs. And he was able to participate in a specialized program throughout high school. So he completed, well, actually, he ended up dropping out a week before graduation, but that's getting the certificate wasn't really relevant. He had success. And I think that's a good example in my mind about the need for the diagnosis and the need for an appropriate diagnosis, the right diagnosis. In my mind, I use the analogy of somebody that has a sensory difficulty. If somebody is deaf, for example, just saying to them, you've got a sensory issue, sensory disability. So we're going to put you in a class for people that are blind because people that are blind have sensory deficits too. And it's all going to be good because you both have sensory disorders. So
why wouldn't it work for you? But it doesn't, because it doesn't recognize the uniqueness of that disability. So I think that, again, diagnosis and appropriate diagnosis is really important, but it's only the beginning. It allowed us to advocate for the kids, but it didn't guarantee that services and supports were available throughout their lifespan. And I think that's one of the areas too, that there is really truly a violation of the human rights of people with FASD, because they can't find the supports and services that they need in terms of education, in terms of addiction services, for example, of housing, of lifelong support. And in speaking of few caregivers, one of the concerns that we often have is what's going to happen when you're not available, because most of the support throughout the lifespan really falls on the caregivers. And I gotta say, we're a pretty exhausted bunch. We're struggling to try and find access to services and supports, particularly when they start to transition into adulthood. And we have great concerns about what's going to happen when we're no longer there to be able to provide that support. So there needs to be a commitment for lifelong supports and services for health, physical health, mental health, addiction services for people with FASD. Sorry, I'm getting on a bit of a bandwagon there, but I'm going to turn it back over to you, Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Dorothy. I mean, I think you're really highlighting how complicated this all is and how intersectional it is, and calling back to where I started the presentation around the unique complexities of FASD, that we can't just address one thing, because it requires a whole social and systemic approach to how we provide services and supports for people with FASD. And so part of the reason we wanted to start this conversation or start this presentation around diagnosis is because, as Dorothy highlighted, that's really the starting point, that all of these rights are predicated on you being identified as a person with a disability. So those rights are protected. So if you are a person who cannot receive a diagnosis for whatever reason, it might be really challenging to then also advocate for all of your rights if you're not even recognized as being a disabled person. And so on that note, we wanted to talk about one other specific area, which is housing. So housing is a specific right that's identified in the Articles of the UN CRPD in a couple of different ways. So the first one is the right to living independently and being included in the community. And so essentially, this means that, like everyone else, people with disabilities should have the right to choose where they want to live, have the right to choose who they want to live with, have access to supports and services that support them in their independent or interdependent living, have the right to have a family, have the right to have children, choose where to live with your family, and so on. But as you know, that often is not the case for people with FASD and people with other disabilities. And certainly, I mean, housing has been a hot button issue for a lot of people in the past few years, and is an area of particular focus at CanFASD right now in a couple of different ways. And so in terms of the rights here, in terms of Article 19, so persons with disabilities have the opportunity to choose their place of residence, with whom they live, and importantly, not be obligated to live in a particular living arrangement. So should not be forced to live in a group home, should not be forced to live in other institutionalized settings, have the right to choose where they live. That they should have access to a range of in-home residential and other community supports that help with that successful living at home. And also importantly, to also prevent isolation and segregation from the community. So not a approach to supported but separate, but actually integrated into communities and giving back to the communities with which they live. That these services and facilities are available on an equal basis and are responsive to needs. So as Dorothy was speaking to, really understanding the individualized needs of the particular person that you're supporting, and being responsive to that. So even in the context of FASD, it's a spectrum disorder. Not everyone is going to have the same needs for support, and may have different needs in different ways in different areas of life. And so recognizing that with everyone that you're working with. As I mentioned, in terms of the context of respect for home and respect for family, that we're working to eliminate discrimination against people with disabilities in all areas related to marriage, family, parenthood, and relationships. And so there certainly have also been conversations for a long time in the disability field and in FASD about the right to be a parent, the rights of people with disabilities to get married. For a long time, used to say that people with disabilities shouldn't marry. And so really working to also combat all of these societal stereotypes that have been entrenched for quite some time, so that persons with disabilities who are of marriageable age can marry and have a family, that they can decide freely and responsibly on the number of children, the spacing of their children, and again, coming back to the lens of support, have the means necessary that enables them to do this successfully, and also to make sure that their rights are provided and upheld. And again, a bit beyond the context of this presentation, but also when it comes to children, and being of childbearing age, also retaining their fertility on an equal basis with others. So this gets us into conversations about forced sterilization, and other things that people with disabilities have been subjected to historically, and that many disabled people and Indigenous people are still subjected to now. And so this is also a really important point of conversation when it comes to rights in terms of family and home. And then lastly, the right to adequate standard of living and social protection. So it's not enough to just ensure that someone has a place to live. It actually needs to be adequate in terms of all of the things that it means to live successfully. So having access to food, clothing, housing, clean water, all of those things that are really important basic necessities of life, again, without discrimination on the basis of disability. So that individuals with disabilities have the right without discrimination, that these are safeguarded and promote the actual realization and enacting of these rights, and have access to appropriate and affordable services, devices, and other things. So for example, technology to support their disability related needs in their living. Also important in conversation. So again, you can see how many caveats there are to enacting these rights. And also I think this represents the breadth with which the UN CRPD is used, that it covers a lot of different types of disabilities, and really trying to be responsive to what that might look like. For example, for developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, and so on. But also wanting to ensure social protection programs for people with disabilities and poverty reduction programs, and that persons with disabilities and their families living in situations of poverty have assistance from the state with their disability-related expenses, so financial assistance, respite care, and so on. And then lastly, ensuring that individuals with disabilities have access to public housing programs, if needed, and also ensuring that people with disabilities have access to retirement benefits and programs. So again, thinking about these kinds of rights being expansive across the lifespan, that we're not just maybe thinking about, as Dorothy was mentioning, the transition from child services to adult services, so housing at that point, but also ensuring that people with disabilities are supported for their entire lives. And so if they no longer have a caregiver or support worker or someone supporting them, that they are financially set also for their lives in retirement and into older age. So with that, I'd also like to invite Dorothy and Lauren back again for a conversation about what this really means to you. And so once again, I'll start with Lauren. And I know that housing has been a very important conversation for the Affect Committee for the past couple of years, and I know that you were sent with a lot of thoughts from everyone. So I'm wondering if you could share some of the concerns that the Affect Committee has about housing for people with FASD.
Yes, so I had while I was preparing for all of this, I had a huge conversation with the Affect Committee, because we all know this disability is a spectrum. And so it was not fair for me to talk just based on my own experience with housing. I will tell you that I do live alone. I do live independently. I have a cat, and my mother lives within the same town that I live in, just a few blocks away from me. But I'm very independent. I do a lot of things on my own, actually everything on my own, really. And I have a very great relationship, a fantastic relationship with my mother, who lives just down the street if I need a cup of sugar, which I don't. But if I did, that's exactly what I would have. Ask for. So I talked to Sandra, Noel, and Jessica, and Niall, and Chris, and Maria about and asked them just different things on housing. So Sandra said the affordability of housing will be good. Jessica said organizational support too. Niall said managing bills and rent and groceries and budgeting. Chris said there is a rent top up that needs to be increased. Maria said daily living skills support in residences, supported living residences for people with FASD when needed security, have supported programs or residences for families with parents diagnosed with FASD. And then Maria said also that we need to do a lot more educating on with landlords and around landlords and the tenancy rates and stuff. I agree with that because a lot of us with FASD have dysmaturity as well as part of our disability. It's kind of like a comorbidity, I guess, of FASD. And so understanding what we are exactly signing when it comes to leases can be very tricky for people with FASD because we don't understand the language that is in there. We don't understand the wording that's in there. And the wording is often so complex that we don't even understand what we're signing away on. I know that I struggle with that myself, with signing away on leases and signing away on different things. And we also, out here in BC and probably a lot throughout Canada, is our rents are atrocious, to be honest. And so when you are only living on a fixed income, some of us are only living on fixed income, you can't expect our income to match what the landlords are expecting for us to pay. And so there's that gap of we live a lot of the times in below poverty in a lot of aspects. So to keep housing and to sustain housing and to keep a roof over our heads is just not, it's just not something that we're able to obtain at sometimes throughout our life. I've been very fortunate and very blessed to maintain housing throughout most of my life. And so but I know that this is the spectrum, and so there's a lot of people that are homeless and that probably have this disability as well, that because of lack of diagnosis and lack of everything else, support and everything else, they can't even obtain housing. So housing is there's a lot to unpack with housing, but those are just some of the concerns from the aspect committee, who sit on a broader range of scale of the spectrum. So I wanted to include their voices as well. Okay, Dorothy, your turn.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. You bring up a lot of really important points, and I think one of the important points you brought up was just the difficulty in getting a livable income. In terms of my own experience, both of my kids have ended up with periods of being insecurely housed and couch surfing and that kind of thing. It seemed like the milestone that they really hit at the time that most people do is that need to be independent, and the desire, the need to move away from our family home. And it was very difficult to try and find anything that could provide the kinds of supports and services they needed. there was just not a lot of options. We looked at therapeutic homes, we looked at group homes, we looked at even, sort of residential education programs. I know that's not necessarily the right way to say it, but there are some really good programs that do provide housing as well, but the access to those was really difficult. So they both ended up at certain times being insecurely housed, for sure. And I think part of it was, as you mentioned, just that lack of a livable income. I was listening to CBC the other day, and they said that the disability allowance would have to go up to $2,500 a month. It's nowhere close to that to even provide a livable income. There's also a lack of awareness of the needs of people with FASD, particularly in terms of providing support in the housing, like you're talking about. A lack of flexibility in housing options. Again, you talked about the lack of affordable housing, which is huge. And there's also a lack of low barrier housing. I know my granddaughter she's Métis. She has a history of trauma. She is battling with addictions. She has difficulty in terms of budgeting and trying to find accommodation, and trying to support her through finding accommodation has just been a nightmare. And it's only through support networks and the services that are provided through support networks and being able to get a caseworker that's been able to help her provide, the day-to-day help she needs in terms of managing just that process of applying for an apartment, let alone the support she's going to need in terms of budgeting and getting the income that she needs to be able to support it. And so again, a lot of times it lands on caregivers to provide the support and to provide the financial income that they need to maintain housing. And that's really a burden that should not be on caregivers. It should be provided. They should be able to get a livable income through disability.
Thank you all so much for your presentations, your feedback, your everything. We really, really appreciate it. And for those of you that have joined us, you can stay involved with CanFASD through all our social media and other resources. And so thank you all very much. And we wish you all a happy holidays. Take care.